every morning at exactly 4:47 a.m. While most of the town remained asleep and the streets were still wrapped in silence, a man named Daniel Harper woke up in the same quiet house he had lived in for nearly 30 years. He would walk into the kitchen, pour himself a small cup of coffee, sit at the same wooden table near the window, and open a black notebook that no one in his family was allowed to read. For 27 years, he followed this routine with absolute precision. Storms came and went, winters passed, birthdays were celebrated, and life moved forward, but Daniel never missed a morning. Then one autumn day, Daniel Harper died suddenly, and when his family finally opened those notebooks, they discovered a story that forced them to question everything they thought they knew about the quiet man who had shared their home. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Harper lived in a small Midwestern town where routines rarely changed and most people knew each other by name. He worked as a maintenance technician at a local manufacturing plant, the kind of job that required patience more than recognition. Machines break, gears were down, and someone has to keep everything running. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel was that person. His coworkers described him as reliable and calm, the type of man who would stay late to finish a repair without expecting praise. Outside of work, he lived a quiet life with his wife Karen and their son Michael, spending weekends fixing things around the house or helping neighbors with small repairs. Yet there was always one detail about Daniel that stood apart from the rest of his routine: the alarm that rang at exactly 4:47 every morning. Not earlier and not later. The number never changed. Karen noticed it during the first year of their marriage, but assumed it was simply a habit from Daniel's early shifts at the factory. Over time, the ritual became so normal that she rarely thought about it again. Daniel would wake, prepare his coffee, open his notebook, and write something before the sun even appeared above the rooftops. When she once asked what he wrote every morning, Daniel simply smiled and said it helped him organize his thoughts. Their son Michael grew up seeing the same pattern every day of his childhood. Some mornings he wandered into the kitchen before school and saw his father sitting quietly with the notebook open in front of him. Daniel always closed it quickly when someone entered the room, as if the pages contained something deeply personal. Michael assumed it was a journal or perhaps notes related to work. Children rarely question the habits of their parents, and the early mornings at the Harper house eventually felt like just another ordinary detail of family life. But long before those notebooks filled the drawer in Daniel's desk, there was a moment that shaped the rest of his life. 27 years earlier, on a rainy night outside town, Daniel had been driving home with his closest friend, a man named Robert Lawson. The two had spent the evening celebrating a promotion Daniel had just received at the factory. The roads were quiet, and the rain had been falling steadily for hours. Somewhere along a winding stretch of highway, the tires of Daniel's car lost traction on the wet pavement. The vehicle slid across the road and struck a tree with devastating force. When emergency crews arrived, Daniel was injured but alive. Robert Lawson did not survive the crash. Investigators later concluded that weather conditions and the slick road had caused the accident. No criminal charges were filed, and the incident was officially ruled an unfortunate tragedy. Yet the absence of legal blame did little to ease the weight Daniel carried after that night. For months, he barely spoke about the accident, returning to work and daily routines while quietly struggling with the memory of losing the friend who had been sitting beside him. Friends noticed subtle changes in Daniel during the months that followed. He became quieter, more thoughtful, as if every conversation carried a deeper meaning. The first time Karen noticed him waking before sunrise was only weeks after the accident. She assumed he was having trouble sleeping, which would have been understandable after such a traumatic event. But instead of tossing and turning in bed, Daniel began walking into the kitchen each morning and sitting down with a notebook. At first, there was only one notebook, a simple black cover with lined pages inside. Daniel kept it beside the coffee maker, so it would be the first thing he saw when he entered the kitchen. Every morning he opened it, wrote something carefully, and closed it again. As the years passed, that single notebook turned into 2, then 5, then 10. Each year he started a new one, labeling the cover with the date and placing the finished book neatly into a locked drawer in his desk. By the time Daniel reached his late 50s, 27 notebooks filled that drawer. Karen and Michael had seen the collection grow, but never questioned its purpose. Everyone has private thoughts, and Daniel was not the kind of man who enjoyed explaining his emotions. Life continued around the quiet ritual. Michael graduated from high school and eventually moved to another city for work. Karen continued her part-time job at a local library. Daniel remained at the factory, fixing machines and returning home each evening with the same calm expression he always carried. Then one October morning the routine stopped. Karen woke up expecting to hear the familiar sound of Daniel moving through the kitchen before sunrise. Instead, the house remained completely silent. At first, she assumed he had turned off the alarm and fallen back asleep, something he had never done before. When she tried to wake him, she realized that Daniel Harper had passed away quietly during the night. The sudden loss left the family stunned, and the small town that had known him for decades gathered to pay their respects. In the weeks after the funeral, Karen and Michael began sorting through Daniel's belongings. Most of what they found reflected the simple life he had lived. Old tools, family photographs, work uniforms folded neatly in the closet. Eventually, Michael noticed the locked desk drawer in his father's office. Inside were the notebooks he had seen growing up. He searched through Daniel's keys until he found the tiny one that fit the lock. When the drawer opened, the notebooks were arranged perfectly from oldest to newest. Michael picked up the first one, labeled with the year the accident had happened, and slowly opened the cover. On the first page, he saw a single sentence written carefully across the top line. "Today I will try again." He turned the page and found the same sentence written again and again, dozens of pages filled with the exact same words. At first, Michael didn't understand what he was reading. Why would his father write the same sentence every morning for an entire year? He opened the next notebook and discovered the same pattern repeating day after day. But as he continued reading through the pages, he began noticing occasional entries written beneath the sentence. Short descriptions of small actions taken during the day: helping a neighbor repair a broken fence, buying groceries for a stranger who couldn't afford them, spending an afternoon volunteering at a community center. Slowly, the meaning behind the notebooks began to reveal itself. After the accident that took Robert Lawson's life, Daniel had made a decision about how he would live the rest of his own life. Each morning, he woke up and wrote the same promise to himself: "Today I will try again." It was a reminder that every day he survived carried responsibility. The entries beneath the sentence were records of the ways he tried to honor that promise. The notebooks told the story of a man quietly dedicating nearly 3 decades to making small acts of kindness part of his daily routine. None of the moments were dramatic enough to attract attention. They were simple gestures that most people might forget within days. Yet together they formed a powerful record of how Daniel chose to spend the years after the accident. Near the end of the final notebook, Michael found a longer entry written just days before Daniel passed away. In it, his father reflected on the night of the crash and the years that followed. He wrote about the guilt he carried and the promise he made at Robert Lawson's grave shortly after the funeral. Daniel had vowed that every morning he woke up would be a chance to live in a way that honored the friend he lost. The final line of that entry was written with the same careful handwriting that filled every page of the notebooks. It read, "I hope the life I lived was worth the second chance I was given." For Karen and Michael, those words transformed their understanding of Daniel Harper. The quiet man who woke before sunrise every morning had been keeping a promise to himself for 27 years, one page at a time. Why would someone wake up at the same exact minute every day for nearly 3 decades? Why would a quiet man like Daniel Harper sit alone at a kitchen table before sunrise, writing inside a notebook that no one in his own family was allowed to read? And what could possibly be so important that it had to be written down every morning without fail for 27 years? Those questions were the first things Michael Harper asked himself as he stood in his father's office holding the first black notebook in his hands. The drawer where Daniel kept them had remained locked for as long as anyone in the family could remember, and opening it felt less like curiosity and more like stepping into a part of Daniel's life he had never shared. Karen Harper sat quietly across the room as Michael turned the pages. The house felt different without Daniel's early morning routine echoing through the kitchen. For years, Karen had woken up to the faint sound of a chair sliding across the floor and the gentle clink of a coffee mug being set on the table. Those sounds had become part of the rhythm of the house, as natural as the sunrise itself. Now the silence felt unfamiliar. The alarm that once rang at 4:47 every morning had been turned off, but the memory of it still lingered, as if the house itself expected Daniel Harper to walk into the kitchen again. Michael looked back at the notebook, reading the same sentence written again and again across the pages. "Today I will try again." At first it seemed simple, almost ordinary, but the longer he stared at those words, the heavier they felt. They were not written casually. Each line looked deliberate, steady, as if Daniel had taken a moment every morning to think carefully before placing the pen on the page. Michael imagined his father sitting at the table in the quiet darkness of early morning. The same routine repeated thousands of times over nearly 3 decades. But the real question was not just why Daniel Harper woke up early. It was why he needed to write those words every single day. What was he trying to remind himself of? Michael knew about the accident that happened years before he was born, the crash that took the life of Robert Lawson. It was a story rarely mentioned in the Harper household, spoken of only in brief moments when someone else brought it up. Daniel never explained how deeply the event had affected him. To the outside world, he simply moved forward with his life. Yet now, standing in the quiet office surrounded by 27 notebooks, Michael began to understand that Daniel Harper had never truly left that moment behind. The accident may have been ruled a tragedy by investigators, but for Daniel it had become something else entirely. Something personal. Something that followed him into every sunrise that came after. The sentence written inside the notebooks was not just a habit. It was a commitment he had chosen to renew each morning. Karen leaned forward slightly as Michael continued reading through the pages. Occasionally he paused when he found an entry written beneath the familiar sentence. Some of the notes were only a few words long, describing small events from the day before. Others were longer reflections about conversations Daniel had with neighbors, co-workers, or strangers he encountered during ordinary errands. None of them sounded like someone seeking attention. They sounded like someone quietly measuring the kind of person he was becoming. Michael turned another page and found an entry about helping a retired neighbor repair a leaking roof after a heavy storm. Another described Daniel paying for a mechanic to fix a stranger's car when the man couldn't afford the repair. A few entries mentioned visiting Robert Lawson's grave on the anniversary of the accident, leaving flowers and sitting there in silence before returning home. The more Michael read, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel Harper had been using those early mornings to remind himself that every day mattered. The sentence, "Today I will try again," was not about repeating the past. It was about making sure the future meant something. Each notebook recorded the small ways he tried to live up to that promise. There were no dramatic gestures or grand achievements written inside those pages, only quiet actions that reflected the life he had chosen after losing his friend. But one question still remained. Why had Daniel Harper kept this part of his life hidden from the people closest to him? Karen had shared nearly 30 years of marriage with him, yet she had never read a single page of those notebooks while he was alive. Michael had grown up in the same house where they were written, yet he had never known their purpose. The answer to that question slowly revealed itself as Michael continued reading deeper into the notebooks. Daniel never wrote the entries for recognition. He never mentioned telling anyone about them. In fact, several passages suggested the opposite. In one notebook, Daniel wrote that the promise he made after the accident was meant to remain private. He believed the value of doing something good disappeared the moment it was done for attention. The notebooks were not meant to impress anyone else. They were simply a record for himself, proof that he was trying to honor the second chance he believed he had been given. As Michael closed the notebook for a moment, he realized that the story inside those pages was far more personal than he had expected. What began as curiosity about an unusual routine was turning into something much deeper. The truth behind the morning secret was not about a mysterious habit or a hidden obsession. It was about regret that never fully disappeared, redemption that unfolded quietly over time, and a promise Daniel Harper had made long before the sun came up on thousands of mornings that followed. Daniel Harper was 58 years old when he died, and for most people in his town his life could be described in a few simple sentences. He lived in a quiet Midwestern neighborhood lined with maple trees and modest homes built decades earlier. The town itself was the kind of place where people greeted each other by name at the grocery store, and where the same diners had served breakfast to factory workers every morning for generations. Daniel Harper had grown up there, graduated from the local high school, and eventually settled into a life that looked very much like the lives of the men who had raised him. He wasn't famous, and he certainly wasn't wealthy. Daniel worked maintenance at a manufacturing plant just outside town, a job that required long hours and a steady hand but rarely brought attention. His workdays were spent fixing conveyor belts, tightening loose bolts on aging machines, and solving the small mechanical problems that kept the factory running. It was the kind of work that most people never noticed unless something went wrong. Yet to the people who worked beside him, Daniel Harper was known as the man who could quietly repair almost anything. At home, his life followed a familiar rhythm that rarely changed. Daniel lived with his wife Karen in the same house they had purchased shortly after their marriage. The walls held photographs from different stages of their life together. A younger Daniel standing beside Karen on their wedding day, family portraits taken during their son Michael's childhood, and snapshots from summer barbecues with neighbors who had lived on the same street for years. Nothing about the Harper home suggested anything unusual. It looked like the home of a working-class family that valued stability and routine. Yet there was one detail about Daniel Harper's life that quietly set him apart from everyone else in town. Every morning, long before sunrise touched the rooftops of the neighborhood, Daniel was already awake. While the rest of the town slept and the streets outside remained empty, the kitchen light in the Harper home would turn on at exactly 4:47 a.m. It was a time so precise that Karen eventually stopped setting her own clock by it. She knew that if Daniel was awake, it had to be 4:47. Karen Harper had noticed the early mornings almost from the beginning of their marriage. At first, she assumed her husband simply had trouble sleeping. Many people who work long shifts develop strange sleep patterns, and Daniel had spent years working irregular hours at the factory. When she asked him about it once, he smiled gently and said that waking up early helped him gather his thoughts before the day began. Karen accepted that explanation and eventually grew used to hearing the faint sounds of Daniel moving through the kitchen before dawn. Their son Michael had a different explanation for his father's routine. Growing up, he believed the early mornings were just a leftover habit from Daniel's work schedule. The factory sometimes required overnight maintenance, and Michael assumed his father's internal clock had simply adjusted to those hours. When he occasionally wandered into the kitchen before school, he would see Daniel sitting quietly at the table with a cup of coffee and a notebook open in front of him. Daniel would greet him warmly but close the notebook almost immediately, as if the pages contained something private. Michael never thought much about it at the time. Parents have routines that children rarely question. To him, the early mornings were simply part of who Daniel Harper was. But as the years passed, it became clear that the habit was far more deliberate than anyone realized. Daniel didn't just wake up early when he had work the next day. He woke up early every single morning. Weekends, holidays, vacations, even days when he was sick. The alarm rang at the same time, and Daniel always rose to answer it. What no one in the Harper household fully understood was that those quiet mornings always followed the same exact pattern. Daniel would walk into the kitchen, pour himself a small cup of coffee, and sit at the wooden table positioned near the window. Waiting for him, there was a black notebook and a pen. He would open the notebook carefully, write something on the page, and then close it again before sitting silently for a few moments. Only after finishing this ritual would he begin preparing for the rest of the day. Over the years, those notebooks slowly multiplied. At first, there was only one, then another appeared beside it. By the time Michael was in high school, Daniel had started keeping the filled notebooks in his office desk. Each one had a year written on the cover in neat handwriting. When a new year began, Daniel started a fresh notebook and placed the previous one into the drawer with the others. The collection grew steadily until it filled nearly the entire space inside the desk. Daniel kept that drawer locked at all times. The key remained on the small ring he carried in his pocket every day. Karen noticed the growing stack of notebooks, but never insisted on reading them. Marriage teaches people to respect certain boundaries, and Daniel had always been a private man. Whatever he wrote during those early mornings seemed deeply personal. Karen assumed it was a form of journaling, perhaps a way for him to process thoughts he preferred to keep to himself. By the time Daniel Harper reached the age of 58, there were 27 black notebooks stored inside that locked drawer. Each one represented an entire year of mornings that began at 4:47 a.m. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel had followed the same quiet ritual without ever explaining its meaning to anyone around him. To his co-workers, he remained the dependable man who repaired machines at the factory. To his neighbors, he was the friendly figure who helped fix broken fences and waved from his driveway. But the notebooks told a story that no one else knew existed. A story that began long before the Harper family ever moved into that house. A story connected to a moment in Daniel Harper's past that shaped every morning that followed. For 27 years, the pages remained hidden behind the locked drawer, untouched by the people who loved him most. And they might have remained that way forever if Daniel Harper had not died on a quiet October night, leaving behind the one secret he had never intended anyone to discover. Daniel Harper died on a quiet Tuesday morning in October, the kind of morning that begins slowly in a Midwestern town where nothing seems to change very quickly. The streets outside the Harper home looked the same as they always had. A few cars passed through the neighborhood. The local diner opened its doors for early customers, and the factory, where Daniel had worked for nearly 3 decades, continued operating as usual. To the outside world, there was nothing dramatic about the day Daniel Harper's life ended. Yet inside the Harper home, a quiet discovery was about to reveal a part of Daniel's life that no one had ever truly understood. In the weeks following the funeral, Karen Harper and her son Michael began the difficult process of sorting through Daniel's belongings. It is a task many families eventually face, carefully deciding what to keep and what to store away. Most of what they found felt familiar. Old photo albums filled with pictures from birthdays and family vacations. Boxes of tools Daniel had collected over the years while repairing machines at the factory and fixing things around the house. Work uniforms neatly folded in the closet, still carrying the faint scent of machine oil that had followed him home for years. But then Michael noticed something that brought back a memory from his childhood. The desk in Daniel's office had always contained a locked drawer. Growing up, Michael had seen his father place notebooks inside it at the end of each year. At the time, it seemed like nothing more than a personal habit. Yet now, standing alone in the quiet room, where Daniel once worked late into the evening repairing broken appliances for neighbors, the locked drawer suddenly felt important. Michael searched through his father's keys until he found the small one that matched the lock. When the drawer finally opened, the contents inside were arranged with the same careful order Daniel had used throughout his life. 27 black notebooks filled the space from front to back. Each one looked almost identical to the others except for the year written on the cover in neat handwriting. The earliest notebook showed a date from nearly 3 decades earlier. The most recent one was labeled with the current year, only partially filled. Together, they formed a quiet timeline of Daniel Harper's mornings. Michael reached into the drawer and picked up the oldest notebook. The cover felt worn from age, but still sturdy. Karen watched from across the room as he opened the first page, expecting to see the kind of personal journal entries people often keep for themselves. Instead, he saw a single sentence written across the top line of the page. The handwriting was unmistakably Daniel's, careful and steady, as if written with patience and intention. "Today I will try again." Michael turned the page slowly, expecting the next entry to explain what the sentence meant. Instead, he found the exact same words written again, and then again on the next page. Page after page carried the same sentence repeated with almost perfect consistency. The ink changed slightly over time as different pens were used, but the message never changed. "Today I will try again." At first, neither Michael nor Karen knew what to make of it. The idea that Daniel Harper had written the same sentence every morning for an entire year seemed confusing. Why would someone repeat the same words day after day without explanation? Michael flipped through more pages, hoping to find a longer entry that might provide context. But the sentence continued appearing again and again, written carefully each morning as if it held some meaning only Daniel understood. Curiosity soon turned into determination. Michael reached for the next notebook labeled with the following year. He opened it and immediately saw the same sentence greeting him on the first page. "Today I will try again." The pattern repeated throughout the entire book. Karen leaned closer, reading over his shoulder as he turned page after page. Each entry looked deliberate, never rushed or careless. Daniel had clearly treated this ritual with respect. As they continued examining the notebooks, something else began to stand out. Occasionally, beneath the familiar sentence, Daniel had written a few additional lines. Some entries were short, only describing a brief moment from the day before. Others were slightly longer reflections about people he encountered or decisions he made. The more Michael read, the clearer it became that those extra notes were connected to something much deeper than a simple morning routine. The early entries mentioned small events that seemed ordinary at first glance. Daniel wrote about helping a coworker repair a machine that had broken down late in the evening. Another entry described stopping to assist an elderly neighbor whose car had stalled along the road. There were notes about volunteering at a community event and fixing broken furniture for someone who could not afford to replace it. Each time the description appeared beneath the same opening sentence. Today I will try again. Karen sat quietly as Michael continued reading through the pages. The room felt strangely calm, yet the meaning behind the notebooks slowly began to shift the way they saw Daniel Harper's life. The sentence that first appeared confusing now felt intentional, almost like a personal promise he had repeated every morning before the day began. But the reason behind that promise was still unclear. Michael eventually reached the final pages of one notebook and opened the next. The pattern continued year after year without interruption. Daniel Harper had woken up at the same time each morning, written the same sentence, and occasionally recorded small actions that followed. The notebooks formed a quiet record of thousands of mornings that most people in his life had never witnessed. At first, the discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had Daniel chosen those exact words? What did he mean when he wrote that he would try again? And why had he kept the notebooks hidden from the very people who knew him best? Karen realized that the routine she had lived beside for decades had a meaning she had never fully understood. But as Michael continued reading deeper into the notebooks, something began to emerge from the entries that followed the sentence. A pattern that pointed back to a moment in Daniel Harper's past. A moment connected to the accident that took the life of Robert Lawson many years earlier. The notebooks were not simply journals filled with daily thoughts. They were records of something more personal. The deeper Michael looked into those pages, the more he realized that Daniel Harper had not been documenting his life the way most people write diaries. The notebooks were not meant to describe what happened during his day. They were meant to measure something else entirely. Each entry was a quiet attempt to answer the same question Daniel had been asking himself every morning for nearly 3 decades. And that was when the realization began to settle in. Those 27 notebooks were never meant to tell the story of Daniel Harper's past. They were meant to record how he chose to live after one single moment changed everything. As Karen Harper and Michael continued reading through Daniel Harper's notebooks, their curiosity slowly turned into careful attention. At first, they had only skimmed the pages, trying to understand why the same sentence appeared every morning. But the longer they studied the entries, the more they began to notice patterns hidden between the lines. Some days contained only the familiar sentence written neatly at the top of the page. Other days included several paragraphs beneath it, written with more detail and reflection. Those longer entries seemed to appear on certain dates, almost as if Daniel had been marking important moments throughout the years. Michael began comparing the dates written in the notebooks with old calendars and family memories. Slowly, the connection became clearer. The longer entries often appeared on the same week each year. Sometimes they appeared on the exact same day. At first, the meaning behind those dates felt unclear, but then Karen quietly mentioned something she had not thought about in years. There had been a night long before Michael was born, a night Daniel rarely talked about, but one that had shaped much of his life afterward. Nearly 27 years earlier, Daniel Harper had been driving home late one evening with his closest friend, Robert Lawson. The two men had spent the evening talking about work and family, enjoying the kind of conversation that often happens when old friends share a long drive home. The roads outside town were dark and quiet that night, and the rain had been falling steadily for hours. According to the police report filed later, the pavement was slick and visibility was poor along that stretch of highway. Somewhere along a narrow curve in the road, Daniel lost control of the car. The vehicle slid across the wet pavement before crashing into a tree beside the highway. Emergency responders arrived not long afterward, but the damage had already been done. Daniel Harper survived the crash with serious injuries, but Robert Lawson did not survive the impact. The news traveled quickly through the small town, leaving friends and neighbors shocked by the sudden loss of a man many of them had known for years. Investigators examined the scene carefully in the days that followed. Their report eventually concluded that the accident had been caused by road conditions and the loss of traction during heavy rain. Daniel Harper had not been speeding, and there was no evidence of reckless driving. As far as the law was concerned, it was a tragic accident that no one had intended. Daniel was never charged with a crime. Officially, the case was closed. But legal conclusions rarely erase personal guilt. As Michael and Karen read through the notebooks, they began to see just how deeply that night had affected Daniel Harper. In several early entries written during the first year after the accident, Daniel described the moment he woke up in the hospital and learned that Robert Lawson had not survived. The words were careful and quiet, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Daniel believed that he should have been able to prevent the crash. Even though the investigators cleared him of responsibility, he never fully accepted that explanation. For Daniel Harper, the accident became a dividing line between the life he lived before and the life he lived afterward. The notebooks revealed how he struggled during those early months to understand why he had survived when his friend had not. In one entry, he wrote that waking up each morning felt like a second chance he had not earned. In another, he described standing beside Robert Lawson's grave and promising himself that if he was going to continue living, he would have to make those years matter. That promise seemed to mark the beginning of the morning ritual. Not long after the accident, Daniel began waking up before sunrise and writing the same sentence at the top of each page. "Today I will try again." At first, the sentence appeared alone on the page, as if Daniel was simply reminding himself of the promise he had made. But over time, the entries beneath that sentence began to describe the ways he tried to keep that promise. Michael noticed that many of the longer entries corresponded with anniversaries of the crash or moments when Daniel had visited Robert Lawson's grave. On those days, the writing carried more emotion than usual. Daniel described standing quietly beside the headstone, remembering conversations he and Robert once shared, and wondering whether he had lived up to the promise he made years earlier. The notebooks made it clear that the memory of that night had never truly faded from his mind. The more Michael read, the more the morning routine began to make sense. Daniel Harper had not been waking up at 4:47 simply out of habit. The time itself held meaning. According to one of the early entries, 4:47 a.m. was roughly the time Daniel had regained consciousness in the hospital after the crash. That moment became a symbol of the life he had been allowed to continue. Every morning, he woke at that same minute to remind himself of the responsibility he believed came with surviving. Yet, even as the notebooks explained the origin of the ritual, they also hinted at something deeper that Karen and Michael had not expected. Many entries described small acts of kindness Daniel performed throughout the years, helping neighbors or strangers without drawing attention to himself. But scattered among those entries were occasional notes that suggested there was another reason Daniel kept writing each morning. A reason connected to a promise he had made that went beyond simply trying to live a better life. Near the middle of the notebooks, Michael discovered an entry written several years after the accident that stood out from the rest. The handwriting looked slightly heavier, as if Daniel had taken extra care choosing his words that morning. The sentence at the top of the page remained the same as always, but beneath it Daniel had written something that neither Karen nor Michael had ever heard him mention during his lifetime. The entry described a visit Daniel made to Robert Lawson's grave late one evening after work. According to the notebook, Daniel had stayed there long after the cemetery had emptied, thinking about the years that had passed since the crash. What he wrote next suggested that something happened during that visit that changed the way he saw the promise he had been repeating every morning. Michael read the line slowly, realizing that the meaning behind Daniel Harper's notebooks was about to become even more complicated than they had first believed. Because the entry revealed that the morning ritual was not only about remembering the accident, it was also about something Daniel had decided to do afterward, something he had quietly continued for years without ever telling the people closest to him. As Michael Harper continued reading through Daniel Harper's notebooks, he eventually came across an entry that stood apart from all the others. The page looked different. The handwriting was slower, more deliberate, as if Daniel had taken extra time choosing every word. The familiar sentence still appeared at the top of the page, written exactly as it had been for years. "Today I will try again." But beneath it, Daniel had written several paragraphs describing a moment that happened long after the accident that took Robert Lawson's life. According to the entry, Daniel had visited Robert Lawson's grave late one evening several years after the crash. It had been a quiet day at the cemetery, and by the time Daniel arrived the sun had already begun to set. He wrote that he stood there for a long time without speaking, simply looking at the headstone and thinking about the years that had passed since that night on the highway. The silence forced him to confront something he had been struggling to understand for a long time. In the notebook, Daniel explained that surviving the accident had never felt like luck to him. Instead, it felt like unfinished responsibility. He wrote that he had spent years wondering why he had been given more time when Robert Lawson had not. Standing at the grave that evening, Daniel finally reached a conclusion that would shape the rest of his life. Beneath the familiar sentence, he wrote another line that Michael read slowly as the meaning settled in. "Every day I wake up is a day I have to earn." For Daniel Harper, those words became the foundation of the ritual he followed every morning afterward. Waking up at 4:47 was not simply about remembering the accident. It was about beginning each day with a reminder that the time he had been given carried purpose. The notebooks revealed that after writing the sentence each morning, Daniel would spend several minutes thinking about one simple question. What could he do that day to make the second chance he believed he had been given matter? As Michael continued turning the pages, the answer to that question appeared again and again throughout the notebooks. The entries beneath the sentence were not random reflections. They were records of the ways Daniel tried to honor the promise he made at Robert Lawson's grave. Some actions were small, almost ordinary moments that most people might never notice. Others were larger efforts that required time, money, and patience. Yet every entry shared the same quiet intention. One notebook described a morning when Daniel stopped at a grocery store before work and noticed a woman struggling to pay for her food at the checkout counter. According to the entry, he quietly stepped forward and covered the cost without introducing himself. Another page recorded the time Daniel learned that a neighbor's teenage son had been accepted into college but could not afford the textbooks required for his first semester. Daniel arranged for the books to be purchased without revealing who had paid for them. There were entries describing weekends spent repairing broken steps on the homes of elderly neighbors who could no longer manage the work themselves. Other pages mentioned volunteering at a local shelter, helping organize supplies and repair damaged equipment after storms passed through town. Sometimes Daniel wrote about simply spending time listening to someone who needed conversation more than anything else. What stood out to Michael and Karen as they read these entries was how carefully Daniel avoided drawing attention to himself. In several passages, he wrote that the purpose of the promise was not recognition. If people knew what he was doing, he believed it would change the meaning behind the actions. For Daniel Harper, the value of the promise came from knowing he was trying to live differently, even if no one else ever realized it. The notebooks continued revealing moments like these year after year. Some entries described acts of kindness that required only a few minutes. Others reflected weeks of effort quietly helping someone solve a problem that seemed impossible at first. Through it all, the sentence at the top of every page remained the same. "Today I will try again." It was as if Daniel Harper began each morning by resetting the promise he had made years earlier. Karen sat quietly beside Michael as he read through the pages, occasionally pausing when a story reminded her of something Daniel had done without explanation. She remembered evenings when he returned home later than usual and simply said he had stopped to help someone. At the time, she never asked many questions. Now the notebooks were showing her that those small moments were part of something much larger. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel Harper had built his life around the promise he made beside Robert Lawson's grave. Each morning, he reminded himself that the day ahead was another opportunity to honor the friend he lost. The notebooks did not describe grand achievements or dramatic changes to the world around him. Instead, they recorded quiet acts that slowly shaped the lives of people who often never knew who had helped them. By the time Michael reached the later notebooks, it became clear that Daniel had never intended anyone else to read these pages. They were not written as a message to his family or as a record meant to be discovered later. They were simply proof that he had continued trying to live up to the words he wrote every morning. A private record of redemption measured not in years, but in the choices he made each day. For Karen and Michael, the realization was both surprising and deeply moving. The quiet man they had known for so many years had been carrying a promise that shaped every morning of his life. The alarm at 4:47, the coffee at the kitchen table, the black notebooks carefully stored in a locked drawer. All of it existed because Daniel Harper believed every sunrise was another chance to earn the life he had been allowed to keep. And until the moment they opened those notebooks, no one had ever known the full story. As Michael Harper continued reading through the last notebook Daniel Harper had written in, he noticed the pages becoming fewer. The entries still followed the same familiar pattern that had appeared for nearly 3 decades. At the top of each page was the sentence Daniel had written thousands of times before. "Today I will try again." Beneath those words were the quiet records of another day spent keeping the promise he had made years earlier at Robert Lawson's grave. But as Michael approached the final pages, he realized he was reading the last morning Daniel Harper had ever written about. The final entry had been written only hours before Daniel died. The handwriting looked steady, just like the pages that came before it. At the top of the page, Daniel had written the same sentence he had repeated for nearly 27 years. "Today I will try again." Beneath it, however, there was something different. Instead of describing a task or a moment from the previous day, Daniel had written a short reflection that seemed more personal than anything else in the notebooks. The words were simple and calm, almost as if Daniel had been speaking quietly to himself while writing them. Michael read the final line slowly, realizing that it was the last thought his father had ever recorded. "I think today I finally understand forgiveness." For a long moment, neither Michael nor Karen spoke. The room felt still as the meaning of those words settled in. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel Harper had carried the weight of the accident that took Robert Lawson's life. Every morning, he had reminded himself that the life he continued living was something he had to earn. Now, in the final entry he ever wrote, Daniel seemed to suggest that something inside him had finally changed. Karen closed her eyes for a moment as Michael gently closed the notebook. The sentence Daniel had written that morning sounded less like a conclusion and more like the quiet release of something he had been holding on to for years. The promise he had repeated every morning had guided the way he lived his life, but forgiveness had never appeared in the notebooks until that final page. Yet the discoveries inside Daniel Harper's office were not finished. As Michael began placing the notebooks back into the drawer, he noticed a small bundle of envelopes tucked behind them. The stack was thick, tied together with a simple piece of string. At first, he assumed they were old bills or paperwork Daniel had forgotten to throw away. But when he picked them up, he realized they were letters. Dozens of them. Each envelope had Daniel Harper's name written on the front. Some looked relatively new, while others were clearly years old. The return addresses came from different places around town and even from neighboring cities. Curious, Michael opened the first letter carefully and began reading. The message inside was written by a man who explained that several years earlier, he had nearly lost his home after a sudden medical emergency left him unable to work. According to the letter, someone had paid several months of his mortgage without ever revealing their identity. The writer explained that he had eventually discovered Daniel Harper was the person responsible, and he wanted to express his gratitude for the help that had allowed his family to stay in their home. Michael opened another envelope. This one came from a young woman who described receiving financial support for college textbooks during her first year at school. She wrote that she had never known who paid for the books until a mutual acquaintance quietly mentioned Daniel Harper's name years later. Her letter thanked him for helping her continue her education when she thought she might have to leave school. The next letter told a similar story. Then another. Each one described a moment when someone's life had been changed by a quiet act of kindness. A repaired roof after a storm damaged an elderly couple's home. Groceries delivered anonymously during a difficult winter. Volunteer work that helped keep a small community center open when it was close to shutting down. Karen sat beside Michael as he opened letter after letter, slowly realizing that the notebooks they had just read were only part of the story. The pages recorded Daniel Harper's promise to try again each morning, but the letters revealed the impact those promises had on people who never knew why he helped them. Many of the writers explained that Daniel had asked them not to tell anyone about his involvement. Most of them had respected that request while he was alive. Now those letters formed a quiet collection of voices from people whose lives had been shaped by Daniel's actions. None of them described dramatic heroics or extraordinary wealth. Instead, they told stories about moments when someone appeared at exactly the right time to offer help without expecting anything in return. Over the years, Daniel Harper had quietly built a legacy that stretched far beyond the walls of his own home. For Karen and Michael, the discovery transformed the way they understood the man they had lived beside for so long. The early mornings at 4:47 were never simply about reflection. They were about preparation. Every sunrise, Daniel Harper asked himself the same question before the world around him had even begun to move. How do I make today matter? The notebooks showed how seriously he took that question. Each page recorded another attempt to answer it through action rather than words. The letters showed the results of those efforts, written by people who had experienced the effects of his choices firsthand. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel Harper had followed the same quiet ritual before the sun appeared in the sky. He woke up, poured his coffee, and wrote the sentence that guided the rest of his day. Today I will try again. Those words reminded him that the life he continued living carried responsibility. They reminded him of the promise he made beside Robert Lawson's grave. In the end, the secret Daniel Harper kept for so many years was not hidden inside the notebooks themselves. It was hidden inside the way he chose to live every day afterward. Each sunrise offered another chance to turn regret into something meaningful, one action at a time. And through thousands of quiet mornings, Daniel Harper answered the question he asked himself again and again until the very last page. Daniel Harper believed something simple yet powerful about the beginning of every day. He believed that every morning is a second chance, a chance to repair something that was broken, a chance to correct a mistake from yesterday, a chance to become someone better than the person you were before the sun went down the night prior. For nearly 3 decades, Daniel Harper woke up at exactly 4:47 in the morning and reminded himself of that belief with a single sentence written carefully across a blank page. Today I will try again. Those words were never meant for an audience. Daniel never planned for Karen Harper or Michael Harper to read the notebooks he kept locked in that drawer. The pages were not written for recognition, and they were not written as a message meant to be discovered after he was gone. They were simply a quiet promise a man made to himself after losing a friend named Robert Lawson and realizing that the years he continued to live carried meaning he needed to earn one day at a time. For 27 years, Daniel Harper kept that promise in the simplest ways imaginable. Sometimes it meant helping someone repair a broken roof. Sometimes it meant paying for groceries when a stranger had no way to afford them. Sometimes it meant giving a young student the chance to continue their education without ever revealing who had made it possible. None of those moments were announced or celebrated. They were simply written down each morning as Daniel tried again to live the kind of life he believed Robert Lawson deserved to see him live. And in the final notebook, on the final page Daniel Harper ever wrote, he left behind the words that perhaps mattered most to him. After thousands of mornings spent repeating the same promise, the last line he wrote suggested that the weight he carried for so many years had finally begun to lift. I think today I finally understand forgiveness. Those words closed the quiet story Daniel had been writing for nearly 3 decades, a story that his family only discovered after his voice was gone. So now we leave you with a question. If you discovered a notebook like this in your own family someday, filled with the private thoughts and promises of someone you thought you knew completely, what would you hope those pages said about the life they lived? Would they reveal kindness that was never spoken about, quiet sacrifices you never noticed, or perhaps a story about redemption that unfolded slowly over time? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy real stories that reveal the hidden sides of ordinary lives, consider subscribing for more. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are not the ones that make headlines, but the ones quietly unfolding in the homes and neighborhoods around us every day. And if you thought Daniel Harper's story was surprising, wait until you hear the next one. Because the next story we're telling involves a man who disappeared for 15 years, only to return with a secret no one saw coming.